The committee should come to order. We are meeting today to consider 16 bills. All have been properly noticed and circulated, and there are copies available on each side of the dais, along with copies of timely filed amendments. Amendments filed after the deadline have been circulated electronically. Pursuant to committee rules, other members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks in the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record with no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the ayes and nays have been ordered. The first item for consideration is H.R. 737, offered by Representative Sablan. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at this time. I will now recognize Representative Sablan to speak to his legislation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for agreeing to include H.R. 737 in today's markup. And I want to echo your comments on how bipartisan this bill is. My bill, the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, has 230 bipartisan co-sponsors, including most of the members of this committee. In our March subcommittee hearing on this bill, one of our witnesses was shark conservationist Linda McCall, wife of the lead Republican sponsor of this bill, Congressman Michael McCall. Clearly, this bill is a common sense solution to making sure our ocean sharks are protected. Fins from about 73 million sharks wind up on the global market every year, causing sharks to be one of the most threatened animals in the world. In fact, globally, 1/4 of all sharks are threatened by extinction. In the United States, we banned the practice of finning sharks, which is inhumane, but that doesn't get at the root of the problem. Too many sharks are still being killed. And although illegal in our waters, fins are imported from other countries where there are inadequate protections. We simply cannot afford to contribute to the shark fin trade or to diminish the United States' leadership in this matter. We need a nationwide ban to aid enforcement and effectively curb the fin trade. 12 states and 3 territories, including my district, the Northern Mariana Islands, already have a ban in place. In addition, over 40 airlines, including all 3 of China's state-owned airlines, 20 international shipping companies, including UPS, and other corporations such as Amazon, Disney, Hilton, and Grubhub all have policies in place to prevent the trade of shark fins. It is time we here in Congress join them. I ask my colleagues for their support of this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Sablan. And does anyone else wish to speak to the legislation?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, sir. H.R. 737 bans the possession and purchase of shark fins in an attempt to stop the practice of killing sharks solely for their fins. And I agree with my friend that the practice is contemptible because of the obvious wanton waste of a valuable resource. But this practice is already illegal under U.S. law. Shark fishing is highly regulated to assure sustainable shark fisheries, and shark fishermen must already account for both the fins and the carcass of every shark they land. This bill actually mandates that the shark fin be thrown away, which is the most valuable part of the shark. How ironic that it mandates what it purports to abhor, the deliberate wastage of our shark resources. It does nothing to enhance conservation, and it does a great deal of harm to American shark fishermen, and I think that's why leading shark biologists oppose the measure. It will devastate our $14 million a year shark fishing industry with no benefits to international shark conservation. The United States is already a world leader in shark conservation, and this bill is simply a solution in search of a problem. U.S. imports of shark fins, which would be subject to this legislation, make up roughly 0.2% of the global market, whereas the U.S. is the 5th largest shark catching country. This means we have much more leverage in the global market by supplying sustainable product. This legislation is going to do absolutely nothing to curb global demand. Like the African lion bill that's also before us today, this bill is opposed by the very groups that depend on a healthy and sustainable population and who have every reason and incentive to wisely conserve, manage, and protect these species. The same leading biologists that oppose this legislation, and the states and the fishermen that depend on our shark fisheries, have proposed an alternative bill authored by Mr. Webster to address the illegal international shark trade. Unfortunately, the Democrats have refused to consider this bill. I'd also, Mr. Chairman, like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the September 2017 article titled, "The Shark Scientists Opposed to a U.S. Ban on the Shark Fin Trade," in which they warned that this bill could, quote, "set shark conservation back by decades." I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Anyone?
Yep.
Floor is yours, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. I am really proud to talk to the 12 members of our committee who decided to show up to listen to the debate on these bills. It does my heart, it warms me up that we care this much about these issues. Look, I opposed this legislation last time, and I'm going to do it again. Last time, we had one bill that was presented in which the staff who were running that bill said, we don't need to talk to anybody, we got lots of co-sponsors. Unfortunately, they did need to talk to people because there were two competing, as Mr. McClintock said, versions of what was doing with this particular bill. One was introduced by a member who is no longer with us. The other was introduced by a member of this committee, Mr. Webster. What we insisted upon last year is that the two sides needed to talk together and come up with a consensus compromise bill. That discussion was ongoing, it was productive, but they did not reach a consensus by the end of the year. Now we're starting over again, and unfortunately the Democrats this time decided to have a hearing, but only invite one side to the hearing. So the other bill was not discussed. See, when we did it before, we did have a hearing, but both bills were discussed at the same time so they could try and at least expose the differences and see if there was some way of coming to some kind of conclusion. But that didn't happen this time. Only one side of this issue was allowed to be heard at a hearing, but that's okay because no one was really listening at that time either. So instead, what we're doing right now is simply pulling the rug out from under those talks and trying to jam through a bill in this Congress simply because there's the votes to do it. But it does not solve the issue. It does not present the problem. It does not present anything else. At a later time, I think I'm going to introduce another couple of amendments because Mr. Webster is ill. He is not able to be here. It is his rival bill that should have been discussed and should have been considered, and trying to see if you can bring some kind of consensus between these two. You should have been able to hear from Mr. Webster. You should have been able to hear from the Wildlife Conservation Society, which does not support this version, but the others. And you should have been able to hear from the industry and craft some kind of consensus piece of legislation. This doesn't do it. So I'm sorry, Mr. Spillane, I like you a great deal, but I can't support your bill because it's the wrong thing to do and it's the wrong process and procedure in which to do it. Yield back.
Other member wish to talk on this particular legislation? Mr. Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and in strong support of my colleague's bill. Look, first of all, I'm gratified that we're all on the same page that we need to protect our sharks and that we understand the science behind the value of sharks in our ecosystems. And so that's a positive advance. Perhaps there is some room to discuss along the way from that basis. That was not always true, by the way. If you go back just 10 or 20 years ago, there was a strong defense of the wholesale taking of sharks from our ocean ecosystems, and fins was part of that take. I think what we have here is simply a decision about which way is the best way to go. I don't think this is a complicated call. I think we've got two ways to go here. One is a full ban that many of our states have adopted, including other countries of the world, and one would impose a very complicated regulatory scheme that has a number of levels of administrative of complexity, involve a number of areas of complicated analysis and enforcement and reliance on sustainable fisheries practices, which are inconsistent throughout our ocean fisheries. And the other way is to just say, no, you can't do it at all to start with. As we well know, it is illegal to take sharks from a shark fin perspective, but not illegal to utilize those fins once they're taken. And so I think that the approach we've taken in this bill is a good, solid policy call. Others may disagree with it. Others that have some interest in continuing some take, whether it's incidental or for direct market purposes. But from my perspective, I'm comfortable with just saying no.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Gallegos.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield my time to the gentleman from Sablan.
Yeah, thank you very much for yielding, Mr. Gallego. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the careful use of words to say no to HR 737. And we acknowledge Mr. Webster's bill 788 is not the best solution for shark conservation as well. That bill is modeled after the shrimp import legislation for sea turtle conservation, and which allows the United States to reject shrimp imports from countries that do not have sea turtle protection programs comparable to that of our United States. And while respectfully, Mr. Webster's bill looks good on paper, however, there are some key differences between that bill and the sea turtle conservation program. And first, the value of shark products into the United States constitute only 0.02% of, as Mr. McClintock earlier said, of 0.02% of the value of shrimp imports. That's 1.6 million in shark products versus 6.5 billion in shrimp products. So our ability to influence the way other countries manage their sharks through access to our markets would be severely limited and very helpful to the conservation of sharks. Second, the United States needs to do more to manage its own sharks and shark data. The U.S. itself would not necessarily be able to meet all the requirements laid out in Mr. Webster's bill, so there's a potential for a World Trade Organization challenge. H.R. 737 is a more straightforward bill that gives the United States the power to end our contribution to the global shark fin trade. My good friend and colleague said the contemptible practice of shark finning. Let's not contribute to that. Let's end it. And so in doing so, we can pressure our other countries to do the same. And I yield back my time to Mr. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Anyone else before we, any further debate before we begin the amendment process? Mr. Bishop, Representative Webster's, you have his first amendment, which is an amendment in nature of a substitute, and the chair will reserve a point of order. You recognize, sir?
Thank you. I wish to move as an ANS the Webster bill, which is the other approach to it, which should have been considered. Whether the Webster bill or this bill that is before us today is the better margin, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps neither of them are, and that's why the consensus process that we were trying to urge last year was the right thing to do. It is very clear that the United States needs to keep the industry involved in this by providing a stable market. We have greater influence on what other countries will do than simply pulling out of the market altogether. And since Mr. Webster is not here, and it's sad that he could not actually be here to defend the process that we're going through, and since We did not have a hearing that involved both bills or understanding the differences between them. I want to present this today as an A&S. Now, I have to admit that my hope was that there would actually be more members here to listen to the discussion on this than were actually here to listen to the discussion on the first base. We've only got 2 other members, so thank you. I can talk to you individually. But to consider both bills is the appropriate thing to do, and to force both of them to sit down and come up with a compromise consensus bill would be the best kind of policy decision. With that, Mr. Grijalva, I'm going to withdraw the amendment so you don't have to do your point of order anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Any further amendments to the legislation? The question is now on adopting the bill as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. Not amended. As and with no amendments and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Say no. And in the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is ordered.
Chairman, now recorded vote, especially if you do it now because we'd win.
A recorded vote has been requested. The vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The next legislation to be called up is H.R. 2406, the item offered by Representative Case from Hawaii. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I will now recognize the gentleman from Hawaii for his statement on his legislation. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One would be hard-pressed to find any agency anywhere in our federal government farther out on the front lines of our future than the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Its satellite and atmospheric operations are at the cutting edge of understanding and acting on climate change and other impacts on our air. Its highly specialized fleet of research and survey ships are leading research on our oceans and protection of our fisheries. Its equally highly specialized fleet of aircraft, including the famous hurricane hunters, heighten our understanding of rapidly changing weather patterns and accuracy of prediction. As just one recent example, NOAA just flew 25-plus round-the-clock missions into the eye of Hurricane Dorian. For all of its research and equipment sophistication, the key to NOAA's irreplaceable mission is its personnel led by its officer corps. As a commissioned service for over a century, since 1917, the NOAA Corps are professional officers in every sense of the word. They function optimally in a command structure. They have specialized training not only in the operation of their equipment and management of their workforce, but in relevant fields such as meteorology, fisheries science, and engineering. They are subject to deployment anywhere, anytime, and spend much of their career away from home and family on deployment, at sea, in the air, or other remote locations. They serve with fellow Navy and Coast Guard officers. They have long been and are fully one of our 7 uniformed services. I introduced H.R. 2406 in April with the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee Chair Huffman and the full committee ranking member Emeritus Don Young. Since then, we have been joined by other colleagues on a bipartisan basis. This bill will first reauthorize the NOAA Corps, which has not been done since Congressman Young passed the last authorization in 2002, and it is past time that we do so. But second, this bill corrects longstanding oversights under which the NOAA Corps has not been treated similarly to its counterparts in the other uniformed services. As a result, NOAA and its Corps have functioned in a patchwork of statutory authorities, benefits, and obligations of service, hurting recruitment, retention, and morale as the demands on NOAA have only increased. Specifically, our bill would authorize education loan and interest payment financial assistance for officers, authorize a pre-commissioning program to provide financial assistance to support tuition for prospective candidates in exchange for an obligated term of service with authority to prioritize students of minority-serving institutions, authorize family programs, mental health resources, and voluntary services such as the implementation of an ombudsman program to improve communication between member families and the service, and make the NOAA Corps officers who serve under honorable conditions for at least 3 years eligible for appointment in federal competitive service positions. And finally, allow former NOAA Corps officers to compete for career conditional positions limited to individuals currently employed within NOAA, allowing NOAA and the nation to retain their skills and expertise in the federal government. This bill also authorizes NOAA to determine the size of the Corps, up to 500 officers, completely subject to Congress's appropriations oversight and control. This is necessary to allow the agency to react to existing needs and provide greater flexibility in assigning officers to different billets. NOAA Corps officers are in high demand throughout the agency and federal government, and often the Corps has no balance to competing needs in NOAA's programs and its operational fleet. Increasing the size of the Corps potentially will help to ensure that the fleet is safely staffed and the NOAA programs can take advantage of the Corps' technical expertise and experience. H.R. 2406 will help the NOAA Corps improve recruitment, retention, and diversity to attract the best and the brightest commissioned officers and better align the NOAA Corps with the other uniformed services as they continue their great service to NOAA and our nation. While the NOAA Corps may be small, they serve this country with distinction, and we owe it to these service members to provide them with the same basic support and benefits to which the other uniformed services are entitled. I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass this bill and supporting the women and men of our NOAA Corps. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. And before any amendment consideration, does any other member wish to be recognized on the legislation?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Young.
I support the original bill. I'm not really excited about the substitute. I will say that because I do think NOAA has a very important role, and I want to congratulate Mr. Case on the introduction of the bill. But the expansion of it to a group that shouldn't be actually getting better benefits than our military people do. And a substitute will do that. NOAA, bless their hearts, other than maybe a hurricane, is none of those people are in threat in their lives, and our military are. The substitute probably increases the benefits by 33%, increases the amount, and having said that, I'm a big supporter of NOAA, regardless of what we have, a prediction of weather, but I have another problem. And Mr. Case, I hope you listen to this. We have a backlog in NOAA for the work they have to do in the Arctic, around our coastal areas, and they don't have the equipment. And there's always been a desire to own their own ships, man their own ships, and I really would like to have NOAA consider the fact of leasing. Again, I promoted this in the Coast Guard, because we're not going to appropriate the monies to get everything necessary for NOAA. You can do it a lot cheaper by leasing, and I'm suggesting to get our mapping done, to get the science done in the Arctic, which I'm interested, we ought to have this done. I'm not going to offer an amendment at this time. I just want everybody to understand that is a problem. And Mr. Casey, I want you to like to consider that. This bill will go to the Senate. Maybe they'll do something with it, but something has to be done to get this back, as they keep further behind, further behind, further behind. And that's not the right way to run this operation. This is a good bill as introduced. The substitute I do have reservations about, because how much better they're being treated than the military itself. And I believe in my Army and the Marine Corps, slightly, and the Navy and the Air Force and the Coast Guard and Merchant Marine. But I don't want, a group that doesn't put their lives on the line to get better benefits from the military. With that, I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be recognized? Sir?
I just want to echo Mr. Young's statement. This isn't about supporting NOAA. This is about treating the research vessels of NOAA as if they were a Navy, so that they can claim the same benefits that we reserve to our military. Abraham Lincoln once said, if you call a tail a leg, how many legs has a dog? The answer is 4. Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it one, and calling NOAA's research vessels a Navy doesn't make them one either. So I'm very much opposed to this bill.
Any other member?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Lambert?
I just have a question for the sponsor. Under existing law, is it true that, and maybe this would even expand it more, that people in NOAA, and as much as I respect NOAA, I'm concerned about this, have burial rights at Arlington, along with our Marines, Navy, People have fallen in wars?
I don't know that. Perhaps somebody else knows the specific answer to that, but I would have no objection to that because they are a uniformed service. They are a commissioned officer corps, and that is at the core of the debate here. There are folks, perhaps you, that don't accept that basic premise. That's the basic premise of the bill. They do put themselves in harm's way. You want to tell the hurricane hunters that they're not in harm's way then when they fly into the eye of that
What about
hurricane?
those who are not hurricane hunters and sit at a desk?
Pardon?
What about those who are not hurricane hunters, who are in an office somewhere their whole career?
If the gentleman will
I
yield.
yield back.
I recognize myself, yield to the gentleman from Hawaii for any more comments.
Well, we're dealing, thank you, Mr. Chair. We're clearly dealing with NOAA, so let's focus the discussion at NOAA. NOAA is a commissioned officer corps, has been for a long, long time. They function as officers. They function in a command structure. They, too, do put their life on the line. We're talking about the hurricane hunters, but if you have been out in the open ocean, you know that that's putting your life on the line. Where is that particularly different from putting your life on the line for any of the other uniformed services? And so, fundamentally, that is the difference that we're having on this bill. And I strongly believe that they are a uniformed service, should be treated that way, have been treated that way for all intents and purposes throughout the years, one of 7 uniformed services, and fundamentally they should be treated the same way as any of the other uniformed services. To my friend and colleague from Alaska, certainly I would support NOAA's mission in the Arctic and the coastal regions and the Bering Sea, et cetera. They function there today. I completely support NOAA's ability to direct adequate resources to that part of our world. I think that's a key part of NOAA's mission. When we take a look at so many of the issues that we discuss on this committee, whether it be our oceans, whether it be our air, whether it be our coastal resources, whether it be our fisheries, I can't imagine a more essential service than NOAA from that perspective, looking out over the next 50 years. And so from the perspective of the actual fleet, which I think my colleague from Alaska is referring to, as you know, NOAA has been basically short-funded on its fleet for a decade plus, and they are in the middle of a recapitalization that is actually just starting at this point, in which we foresee a number of new NOAA ships being able to fulfill that mission, including, I would hope and believe, ships that would be allocated to Alaska and to the Northern Pacific. To my colleague's comment on the use of other resources, NOAA actually does use many other resources, including privatized resources, for much of its mission. So this is not a quote-unquote pretend Navy. This is not an exclusive Navy. They function very much as a Navy in many respects, but they do use other resources, and I think they balance that use pretty well.
Gentleman yields back. This legislation has very strong bipartisan support, and I think the strength of it is that it institutes some common sense, good governance efforts to help align the NOAA Corps, their authorities and responsibilities, with other uniformed services. And as the gentleman from Hawaii said, that's the center of this legislation. I think it's important that we support the men and women in uniform who, in all instances, so boldly and professionally sacrifice for our country, and in this instance, through the NOAA Corps. And so I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and ask, is there, and yield back my time, any other member wish to comment on the legislation? At this point, are there any amendments to the legislation? Will there be any further debate before the amendment process? Without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the legislation? If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended in order and favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered. Roll call has been ordered, and recorded vote has been requested. The vote will be postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. Which one is this? This is not working for me now. This is too much stuff in there. The item now under consideration is H.R. 2245, offered by myself. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now recognize myself to speak on the legislation. The CECIL Act, H.R. 2245, would improve transparency and implementation of the Fish and Wildlife Services Sport Hunted Trophy Import Permit Program. We have heard claims that trophy hunting benefits conservation, but simply pulling a trigger I don't think equals conservation. If trophy hunting can actually lead to positive conservation outcomes, we need to qualify what those outcomes are, including the political and scientific frameworks that make the conservation successful. That's the core of the CECIL Act. If we are going to allow any trophy hunting imports, we've got to use the highest standards to ensure that we are protecting threatened and endangered species. But the current standards are not up to par. According to a report published by this committee after Cecil the lion was killed in 2015, the bar must be set higher for trophy imports to meet the standards set forth in the Endangered Species Act. Regulatory loopholes exist. Trophy import fees are far too low, and more needs to be done to ensure trophy hunting actually benefits conservation. After Donald Trump became president, new harmful policies were put in place that are yet another handout to the NRA, an anti-science and benefit that the extremely rich to the deterrent of wildlife. The bill addresses those policies as well. It bans the importation of elephant and lion trophies from 3 countries in which the previous administration found that trophy hunting was not enhancing the survival of those species. These findings, as you may remember, were what the Trump administration flip-flopped over. They overturned the bans, then the president tweeted his disgust, and they backtracked. Finally, they quietly overturned the import bans again. To this day, I wonder if they ever told the president. The bill also terminates the lopsided International Wildlife Conservation Council, which was convened to promote trophy hunting in the name of conservation. I want to urge your support and urge adoption of the legislation. Is there further debate before? Mr. Buckley?
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I'd strongly urge the committee to pay attention to the governments of Zimbabwe and Tanzania and the other African nations which conduct internationally recognized conservation programs and which are begging us not to enact this legislation, which they warn would dangerously undermine their efforts to preserve these lions in a healthy and sustainable population. Here's what they told us in July and what they're still telling us. They are highly dependent on healthy animal populations for a significant part of their economic development and revenues. They have every incentive to protect these populations and have extensive programs to do so. Regulated trophy hunting is a central part of that equation and a major source of the incentives and revenues they need to maintain these populations. If we collapse trophy hunting, we destroy the very incentives and revenues that underpin their conservation efforts. Trophy hunting places a high value on these animals. It incentivizes landowners and governments to maintain the habitats that are necessary to support healthy populations so that they can be harvested. If we collapse trophy hunting, there's no incentive to maintain these habitats. Trophy hunting is what produces major revenues for these governments to support their conservation programs. This bill would cut off those revenues. Where trophy hunting is legal and regulated, the incentives to combat illegal poaching are immense. Illegal poaching is a direct threat to the commerce that is generated by legal hunting. If we collapse legal hunting, the economic incentive to combat illegal poaching collapses right along with it. Because trophy hunting is legal, it can be monitored and regulated to assure the sustainable management of these populations for all time. If we make the trade of trophies illegal, we forfeit our ability to regulate this trade, and we hand it over to the underground market. At the same time, we promote poaching as a more viable alternative to regulated and licensed takings. I would beg the committee, please, to listen to and to respect the governments of the 23 African nations that depend on hunting for their conservation programs and their economic development, and oppose this bill.
Anyone else, any other member wish to, any further debate on the legislation? Yeah. No.
Thank you, Chairman. Just wanted to point out that these are protections for endangered and threatened species, as well as species proposed to be listed by requiring certification by the Fish and Wildlife Service that any international trophy hunting of those species enhances the conservation of the species before any import of the trophy would be permitted. So I feel like that answers Mr. McClintock's question about the bill. But, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield the remainder of my time to you if you would like more time to speak on your bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Much of the rest of the discussion regarding this bill would be as a consequence of the amendment process. As we respond to that, I appreciate the yield, and we'll need them. Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do oppose this bill. And how many of you have been to Africa? That's what I thought. This is an ill-conceived bill promoted by certain interest groups that do not have anything to do with conservation. I've been to Africa numerous times. I have been a trophy hunter. I will tell you what has happened. Most of my time has been in South Africa. There were 7,600 hunters that went to South Africa. The average cost is $20,000. That's $131 million from South Africa country. 80% of that money stays in the area in which the animals are hunted. There was actually 31,500 jobs created by the black people in South Africa. 17,000 jobs in Limpopo, 9,000 in North Cape, and 4,000 in Free State. The land used for hunting in South Africa is really farmland. All you conservation is farmland. They've let it go back to the wild. By management, this is what's happened in South Africa. 50 years ago, there was 19 million head of animals. After this institution of hunting, now we have approximately 150,000 million animals. Think what's been done there. I've watched the poachers. I've helped apprehend poachers. And it's not just the poachers for trophies, tusks, and other animals. You put this in place and they won't have the money to support the guards and the poacher patrols. And we sit here in our little high seats, making decisions for countries when they've proven they can manage the fishing over there, or the game over there, better than anybody else, just to make somebody satisfied. And by the way, elephants are not endangered, neither nor lions. Yet we do this in a committee that has no knowledge. I just looked around this room, it's been in Africa, watched what's happening. And I can tell you, if I was an African over there and had a little maize garden, and there was no value on that elephant and came in and took my garden away from me, I'd kill that elephant. And that will happen, because there's no value. Same thing with a lion. They eliminate the lions because they also eat what they can kill, poaching, that are protected now because of the anti-poaching movement. So what we're doing today is making some people feel good. And I actually will believe, very frankly, you take away those jobs, 31,000 jobs, that affect the minority in that country, the majority, but the minority essentially because they're very impoverished people. These are not rich people. The jobs have been created, schools have been created, We are saving wildlife. We are saving wildlife, not destroying wildlife. The money that we contribute to South Africa in the trophy hunting ring is large. I want to keep those people employed. I've been there, like I've said before, not just the immediate hunters, that's a little thing. The trackers, that's a little thing. It's the sideline, the kids. How many of you have been over to help the kids? Everybody talks with bleeding hearts on that side. You don't talk. You don't walk the talk. You don't help the poor. You talk and you sit in your nice little offices. Before you even pass something like this, you ought to be able to go over and at least see it at work. So I'm suggesting respectfully, this is a bad conceived bill by a special interest that do not know what they're talking about, and they're going to hurt the animals. You're going to have more animals killed for no reason other than they don't want them invading their territory because there's no value to them. You think about it. Bad piece of legislation. Shouldn't be considered in this committee. Bad piece of legislation for wildlife. Definitely a bad piece of legislation for the impoverished people over there. 31,000 jobs in one country. So vote your conscience. Don't vote for somebody who don't know what they're talking about. Gladly, I don't know how much time I've got.
I just wanted to point out that Washington Examiner today carries an article by Fulton Opinia Mangwanya. He's the Director General of the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Agency. He says, I'm disappointed that some U.S. lawmakers are focused on legislation rooted in unrealistic ideologies that would disempower the government and local communities of Zimbabwe. As lawmakers consider the CECIL Act in the coming weeks, I hope they understand the fact that ceasing the importation of big game animals from Zimbabwe will not contribute in any way to conservation of the ecosystems. In fact, it will have exactly the opposite effect. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I heard a reference by the sponsor of the bill to science. So I would like to introduce into the record with unanimous consent a letter printed in Science magazine dated August 26th of 2019. And the conclusion of this article, it talks about mainly how this will hurt habitat and it will hurt the local communities. So the concluding sentence of this letter says, some people find trophy hunting repugnant, including many of us, but conservation policy that is not based on science threatens habitat and biodiversity and risks disempowering and impoverishing rural communities. So this letter says that the CECIL Act in particular, in their opinion, is not based on science. Is not based on science.
Well, gentlemen, you?
Yes.
The author of that letter, I believe, was the Democrats' witness on the bill.
Well, I was getting to that. There are 128 signatories to this letter, including the majority's witness when we had a hearing on this bill, and including the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is a UN organization not known as a bastion of right-wing conservative politics, and they are against this bill. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I was asking unanimous consent to introduce this into the record.
Yes. Mr. Huffman.
So, Mr. Chairman, if the South African trophy hunting regime is so wonderful, if it's so science-based, if it's great for kids, if it's so great that even the elephants and the lions love it, as my friends across the aisle would tell the tale, well, then surely it could survive a little bit of scrutiny, as this law would require. Surely it wouldn't need an NRA-dominated rubber stamp wildlife council deciding in every single case where we allow trophy hunting and the terms under which it's allowed. Why would such a great program be afraid of some rigorous scientific review and some government analysis from a more credible oversight body? That's all this bill does. And my friends across the aisle can probably do better than holding up Zimbabwe as a shining model of how things can work very well. This is a deeply corrupt government. There are some serious problems with the trophy hunting system. It is riddled with corruption in that country and in many others. So, look, if there are successful models of trophy hunting that are science-based, that are effective, that are actually conserving species, they ought to be able to hold up to the basic standards that this bill requires.
Will the gentleman yield?
However, the piece of this story that my friends don't want to talk about, the cases where these programs are obviously shams, where they're riddled with corruption, that's what this bill is intended to address. And I think, unfortunately, it's being radicalized by some of the rhetoric we're hearing from across the aisle. With that, I yield back.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I wasn't going to say anything on this particular piece of legislation, but I am compelled to do that because we have talked about what would be listed as protected, and actually anything that's proposed could be listed by anybody. But more significantly, this bill only attacks 3 specific countries. The 3 countries that have the most successful sustainable program are the ones eliminated by this bill. This is not going out into the rest of the world. It's talking about 3 countries where it's working. And I'm sorry, that's where my colleagues are correct, that this is for special interest groups. Mr. Lamborn, I'll yield to you if you want.
Yeah, I have a question for the ranking member. Why would this bill go through a very detailed, micromanaged list of what a management plan in these countries should consist of? And I'm not sure it's America's role to come in and micromanage that for other countries of the world. But in any case, it's a very detailed, and then it says on page 3 that no matter what this management plan says, these 3 countries are prohibited no matter what, and that's Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. So they can do one of these management plans apparently and still not meet the approval of the writers of this bill. Is that correct, Mr. Bishop?
Were you asking me or Mr. Grijalva?
Well, I'll ask the sponsor, Mr. Grijalva. And then I'll yield back to you.
It'll come back to me eventually, and then I'll tell you you're correct.
I thought initially you were directed at me, but you said ranking member, and I understand, Mr. Lauber, a little bit of nostalgia and wishful thinking, but nevertheless.
Oh, I meant Mr. Bishop. I am up to date.
The issue is about the political stability, and that's why the analysis and the rigorous work required, the political stability of those countries in terms of being able to enforce the environmental laws that protect these species. And that's the reason for that part of the legislation, because I think it's important to have a blanket trust without verification, and the jeopardy is to the species, I think is a mistake. This talks about verification, quantification, quantifying, and qualifying. And I think that's the process in the legislation, and it's not intrusive, and it's not any kind of intervention other than to making sure those laws are being enforced, and if the government has the willingness, and the capacity to do that.
I'll yield back to the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, and yeah, you were correct, and I'm sorry. There's only 3 countries that are doing it the right way, and this attacks those 3 countries. This attacks the program where it's working. I don't know why anyone would want to do that, but that's what this bill does. I'll yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
I got a minute and a half, go for it.
I just, again, go back to the chairman. If I appropriated an amendment, if I made an amendment to exclude South Africa, would you accept it? Think about it for a moment. They're estimating 19 million head of animals now. In 1950, there was only 500,000 head of animals left. This is a country that's done the thing right, and you're penalizing them against a country that everybody hails as a new democracy that's doing the job right, and you're penalizing them. So I don't understand. Would you accept the amendment, Mr. Chairman, if I said we exclude South Africa?
Would the gentleman yield? Because
I'm not.
I think the bill does not ban South
Actually,
Africa.
If it says lions and elephants, it is banned. It is banned. This is based on CECIL. It's based on CECIL. So you've got to keep that in mind. I'm saying that if you guys really want to do something, let's do something correct.
Unfortunately, it's still my time, so I appreciate it. If you wanted to say something, are you done? Okay.
I'm not done, I'm just finished.
Too bad the bill
That was
isn't.
wishful thinking again.
Yeah. Yep, if I were chairman, you'd have your way already. I'll yield back.
Any further debate before beginning the amendment process? Seeing none, without objection, the NS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. We are open for amendment at this point. The chair recognizes Mr. McClintock for amendment number 1. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the section of the bill that explicitly prohibits permits from being issued by the Secretary for importing sport-hunted trophies of elephants or lions taken in the nations of Tanzania, Zimbabwe, or Zambia. This amendment comes directly at the request of the governments of those nations who fervently believe that this bill would catastrophically undermine their conservation programs. During the hearing of this bill in July, the Democratic majority ignored the countries involved. They preferred to take their testimony from U.S. environmental groups. The Republican minority invited Dr. Patience Gandiwa, a preeminent international authority on African wildlife conservation and responsible for management of Zimbabwe's wildlife and conservation programs. A representative of the government of Tanzania also attended the hearing but was not invited to speak. Dr. Gandiwa warned the subcommittee that banning the importation of sport-hunted trophies from her country and the others that have similar conservation programs would greatly damage their ability to combat poaching and generate the revenues that support their sustainable and internationally recognized conservation efforts. The three nations exempted by this amendment comprise roughly half of the 33,000 lions protected on that continent. These are the nations that are internationally recognized for doing it right. I think perhaps we ought to listen to them rather than to impose our colonial mentalities to manage their affairs. Yield back.
I recognize myself. I oppose the amendment. When the Trump administration overturned the ban on elephant trophy imports from Zambia and Tanzania, President Trump called the elephant trophy hunting a horror show. That said, I would be very happy to work with my colleagues, with my colleague on this amendment as the bill moves forward to make sure that the bill ensures that trophy hunting works well, supports conservation, and be glad to work with him on that. In the meantime, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back my time. Debate on the question is on the amendment designated McClintock 1. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The noes have it. The noes have it. Recorded vote having wisely been requested by Mr. McClintock. This vote will be postponed pursuant to the announcement.
Could we amend that for a roll call and a hearing aid?
Next amendment is Mr. Lamborn, number 2, I think.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. It says, "This act shall be effective on the date that the Secretary of the Interior certifies after public notice and comment that the act will not negatively impact rural African community economies." So this is a very common sense amendment. We had a great witness during the hearing on this bill, Dr. Patience Gandiwa, the Executive Technical Advisor from Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, who testified. And she said that if this bill were to become law, it would have detrimental impacts to rural communities in Zimbabwe and that they receive enormous benefits from the economic activity linked to well-regulated hunting. And as some people have pointed out, and trophy hunting may not be your thing, and I've never trophy hunted myself, but if it gives economic benefit to the local communities, and as opposed to that animal being poisoned or dying of disease or something else like that because of poor conservation practices or results from misguided legislation like this, that's better for everybody concerned. That's a win-win situation. So we want, I don't think the United States should come in and tell these countries what to do in the first place, but we should not definitely come in and tell them what to do when it is bad for them. That's what the people on the ground there say. And I don't remember any testimony during that hearing of people from Africa testifying in favor of the legislation. If there was, I certainly don't remember it. So, and as that science letter pointed out, we want to adhere to science. Well-managed trophy hunting can and does positively contribute to conservation and local livelihoods. That's what the 128 signers of that letter said, which includes the International Union for Conservation of Nature. It includes people like one of the majority witnesses at that hearing. So, Mr. Chairman, I would say that this is a good amendment. I don't think we should oppose it because this is what's good for the people on the ground. If we're going to tell them what to do, let's at least not tell them what to do in a way that hurts them. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself in rebuttal. I can't support this amendment, but I agree with my colleague that we should ensure that local, rural communities are being treated fairly in the process. That's why in my ANS, I made sure to add that Fish and Wildlife Service must analyze the benefit to local communities when making a determination on whether or not to issue an import permit. On the average, only 3% of trophy hunting revenues go to rural communities in which the hunting occurs. I think we can both agree that that's a problem and it's not fair. However, the amendment, I believe's true intention is to give the Secretary of Interior, David Bernhardt, veto power over the legislation. And given the fact that just yesterday he pulled funding from international conservation efforts, I don't think we can feel very comfortable with that or trust that it will be done fairly. For those reasons, I oppose the amendment and urge a no vote. And anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing none? Hearing no further debate on the question is on the amendment by Mr. Lombard, number 2. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is a recorded vote. Having been requested and postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The next amendment is Mr. Lombard's number 3, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This says that this act will be effective on the date that the Secretary of the Interior certifies, after public notice and comment, that the act will not lead to a net wildlife habitat loss through increased commercial development of lands currently preserved for wildlife habitat in countries where sport hunting occurs. And that's one of the other bad things, besides the impact on the local communities. This hurts the habitat and environment of the countries affected, should this ever become law. Right now, there is a large number of acres that are set aside for this type of hunting, and the preservation of the land is dedicated to that purpose. You take away the benefit, and that land's going to revert to other uses, and it will not be kept as well as it is now. That's why that letter from in Science magazine refers to loss of habitat. Based on science, loss of habitat is one of the things that would result from passing this bill, and why we should reject the bill, and why I've offered amendment number 3. Right now, wildlife game populations in the 3 countries that are specifically named that can, I guess, never come out of the doghouse because they can, under the bill, they can fulfill the management plan but still be blackballed. Anyway, you have 50,433 elephants in Tanzania, 81,000 elephants in Zimbabwe, and almost 22,000 elephants in Zambia. This is 21% of the total elephant population in Africa. And this is according to the United Nations group that signed on to that letter opposing the bill. And for example, Zambia's elephant population no longer even meets the criteria for listing under CITES Appendix 1, meaning that they are not threatened with extinction. And in Tanzania, when it comes to lions, there are 12,511, and a shared population of an additional 4,400 that travel across borders. Zimbabwe has 2,300, Zambia has 1,500. And that's half of the 33,000 lions estimated to be in Africa. So if there were anywhere in Africa where hunting is entirely sustainable, it is within these three countries that have successful hunting programs included in their conservation management programs. So, Mr. Chairman, if we want to really respect the environment, if we want to be respectful of science, then we want to adopt this amendment and to make this bill at least a slightly bit better than what it is right now. The lands, and I'll finish up by saying that the lands that are held for private sport hunting in Africa are estimated to exceed 540,000 square miles, which is even more than what's protected by national parks in the continent of Africa. And Mr. Young, I have been to Africa, and I've gone there to look at the management practices, and this bill would not help. Some of the privately managed areas are better kept than some of the government-run areas, to be real honest with you. So we don't want to pass this bill. I think it would go in the wrong direction. I know that it's a well-intentioned bill, but it's based on an emotional reaction to a particular incident. And I think that the way the bill is written, it would be harmful to Africa, it'd be harmful to the communities there, it'd be harmful to wildlife. So I would ask that we adopt this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment, like the last one, tries to give veto power to Secretary Bernhardt to overturn the content of this legislation. The whole point of this legislation is to require a rigorous analysis that trophy hunting would promote conservation and recovery of endangered and threatened species. That's the whole point of the legislation. And the incident that is referenced was watershed in that it made people focus on the practice and the lack of quantitative information as to whether or not the whole argument about this promotes conservation trophy hunting is valid and could be trusted. And so this bill deals with that directly, and I urge opposition to the amendment. And with that,
Mr. Chairman?
Recognize.
Mr. Chairman? Again, with all due respect, because I know this is well-intentioned, well-meaning, but everything the chairman just said was directly contradicted in today's op-ed piece by Dr. Mangwanya. Again, he's the Director General of Zimbabwean Wildlife Management Authority. He is responsible for these programs. And what he writes today is this: it is well documented and well published in multiple scientific studies and technical reports produced by the International Union for Conservation of Nature specialist groups that the single biggest threat to wildlife species, such as the elephant and lion in Africa, is habitat loss. Zimbabwe's network of 6 trans-frontier conservation areas, alongside the Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources, have worked to expand protected land in the country from 13 to 26% of our total land area in Zimbabwe. Securing over 5 million hectares of land outside traditional protected areas is an achievement that was only realized due to the $2 million in big game hunting revenue, which went to over 800,000 families in rural areas. The CECIL Act would rob such initiatives of this funding, eliminating incentives for local communities to participate in these effective conservation initiatives. Ultimately, our government's interconnected conservation matrix relies heavily on community participation. Without money from sport hunting safaris, we would be unable to implement most of our flagship conservation plans. I realize that there is this colonial attitude that we know best. We heard it from my colleague from California, that the Africans cannot manage their own countries because they're corrupt and we have to tell them what to do. That is an attitude that is deeply resented across the African continent for very good reason. And this bill is Exhibit A in the source of that resentment. I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be recognized on the amendment? Hearing no further debate on the question of the amendment designated Lamborn number 3, I ask all those in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote has been requested, and the vote will be postponed pursuant to my prior announcement. We now, the item for consideration is H.R. 1380, offered by Representative Quigley from Illinois. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Huffman, to speak on the legislation. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So H.R. 1380, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, as you mentioned, introduced by our colleague, Mr. Quigley, is a common sense and much-needed solution to address public safety and animal abuse concerns regarding private ownership and public contact with big cats. This is a bill that has, for a long time, had broad bipartisan support, and my hope is that we can now pass it into law. The Big Cat Public Safety Act would end the ownership of big cats as pets and prohibit exhibitors from allowing public contact with big cats, including cubs. People don't need to take selfies with big cats, and big cats should not be kept as pets. It's pretty simple. While the exact number is unknown, it's estimated that thousands of big cats, including lions, tigers, jaguars, leopards, cougars, and hybrids, are currently kept in private ownership in the United States. Since 1990, there have been around 300 dangerous incidents involving big cats in the U.S. that have resulted in human injuries, mauling, and even death. And when these incidents occur, first responders are put at risk since they are not trained or equipped to handle situations involving big cats. I hope we can all agree that privately owned big cats present an obvious and unnecessary risk to the public and to our first responders. In 2003, Congress unanimously passed the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, which amended the Lacey Act to prohibit the import, export, buying, selling, transport, receiving, or acquisition of big cats across state lines and our border. However, the existing law did not include prohibitions for the private possession of breeding of big cats. And currently, our state laws vary quite a bit on this subject. Some have no restrictions at all. Some simply require registration, and some completely prohibit the ownership of big cats as pets. So the Big Cat Public Safety Act is needed. It builds on the Captive Wildlife Safety Act by making it illegal to privately possess or breed lions, tigers, leopards, cheetahs, jaguars, cougars, or any hybrid. And the bill is narrowly focused on privately owned animals. It includes exemptions for exhibitors with USDA Class C licenses, and that would include zoos, state universities, and sanctuaries. So again, this is a bipartisan bill. It is definitely necessary, and it is time that we pass it into law to protect the public from unnecessary harm and ensure humane conditions for these majestic big cats. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Gosar.
Yeah, I stand in opposition to 1380. Once again, this is the federal's intercedence of picking winners and losers. Frankly, this is a handout to the Association of Zoos, Aquariums, and Democrat favorite Dan Ash. This pits small zoos against large zoos, and frankly, pits a contradiction between the policies of the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. This bill interjects the Department of Interior into regulating actions that are outside of its purview and frankly should not even be heard by this committee. This is an issue for the Agricultural Committee to consider. With this contradiction, it is especially troubling that no federal witnesses were called to testify at the legislative hearing on this bill. 1380 is opposed by the Zoological Association of America, and with that, I'd like to enter into the record a letter supporting my position. They quote, H.R. 1380 represents an unwarranted federal intrusion into the rights of responsible wildlife exhibitors and will have significant negative impact on federally licensed zoological facilities, as well as many small and family-owned businesses. End of quote. I therefore ask my colleagues to vote against this bill.
Is there further debate before we begin the amendment process?
Yeah, I will.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, sir. The obvious statement is there's more than one way to skin a cat. But I won't make it because that's too obvious. It's too low of a joke. However, you are absolutely right. What this does is pit one group, big zoos, against small zoos. It also is written in a unique way, bizarre way, to involve the Department of Interior and Agriculture so that it can come, I'm assuming, to this committee. But that's a major conflict. And if implemented, this bill will be a major conflict. It's also, even though it's called the Big Cats Public Safety Act, it's not just about big cats, because it references every species within the body of this particular bill, and we're creating a conflict of how you administer between two branches of government, between two different agencies, and also that it covers every species, not just big cats. So with that, this is not a well thought out piece of legislation. May pass because the votes are here, and even though no one's actually heard the debate, it may pass anyway. But it is taking us in the wrong direction, and that's another bad cat pun, and I'm not going to use that. Yield back.
Debate on the, before we begin the amendment process? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bishop. You have the next amendment. Bishop number 2, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Has this been passed out? I guess it's being passed out now. As it's being passed out, and as I'm listening to other bad cat puns coming from this side of the aisle, it is, and they keep coming. The amendment's really simple. It simply strikes the number of additional requirements that go above and beyond those currently required by USDA permits. If it's Class C facility, that is required. But this underlying bill simply adds a whole bunch of other stuff that has to be in there, which creates a conflict. It's a jurisdictional conflict between USDA and Fish and Wildlife Service. I don't know if that was done by design. It's the only reason this bill is in front of this committee, because otherwise it would be in front of the Agriculture Committee. But if our goal is to strengthen the USDA permit requirements, then we ought to do it the right way. This bill does not do it the right way. This is simply an end run around other committees' jurisdiction, kind of a mockery if you actually think of the process and procedure we're going through, and bad procedure produces bad policy, which is exactly what we're doing. So at least strike out the litany of extra requirements that are put in there that will be regulatory conflicts between two agencies coming into the future. So if you vote against this amendment, which I can't imagine why anyone would want to do that, you are voting for regulatory conflict in the future between battling agencies of government. I urge your adoption of my amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Chairman, I do oppose this amendment. The provisions that the ranking member would strike, that he describes as unnecessary and, redundant regulatory requirements, are actually the heart of this bill that makes sure that the people who handle these big cats actually know what they're doing and know how to protect public safety and know how to protect the animals themselves. This is not, as was said a moment ago, a question of small zoos against big zoos. If you want to think of it as a contest between zoos, it would be real zoos versus fake zoos, or good zoos versus bad zoos. Many of the small, so-called small zoos who are opposing this bill have a terrible record of inhumane and unsafe practices in standards. So, no, if you vote for this amendment, you're actually voting to have lax or no standards for who gets to maintain and exhibit these big cats, and you're voting to allow more, unfortunately, tragic events where public safety is put at risk, first responders are put at risk, and animal welfare is allowed to be put at risk. So I request a no vote.
Back. Any further discussion on the amendments? Mr. Gosar?
Yeah, I yield to the ranking member.
I'm sorry, thank you, I appreciate the yield because I need to contradict what was just said. It's not totally inaccurate. Many of the procedures, some of the procedures that are placed into this new litany of things that can do are new things that do not add to the safety protection of animals. For example, you have a provision in there that allows for a licensed veterinarian or student to accompany a veterinarian, which is good, but then has an or, and that anyone directly supporting conservation programs of the entity or facility can have direct contact with these particular, anyone that wants to go in there, they're a donor, they simply have to, this empowers them to do it. That's part of the regulatory conflict. USDA does not allow that. We are actually implementing a new kind of conflict, that's not limited to those who know what they're doing, but anybody who has a conservation bent or has a donor to a facility. That's why this is a poorly written bill. And that's why this section is the section that ought to be relieved from the bill. I yield back to Mr. Gosar.
And I yield.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Bishop, designated as number 2. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Lousy opinion.
And the amendment is not agreed to.
And roll call.
Recorded vote has been requested and postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Now, the item for consideration is H.R. 1023, offered by Representative Quigley from Illinois. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged for further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment. I will now recognize the Chairman of the committee, Mr. Huffman, to speak on the legislation. Sir?
Mr. Chairman, are we on H.R. 2405 now?
1023.
Oh, number 7, pardon me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry for my confusion there. H.R. 1023, the Great Lakes Fishery Research Reauthorization Act, would codify the authority that already is provided by executive order for the USGS to secure stable funding for fisheries research and science in the Great Lakes. It's a bill that would authorize USGS and the Great Lakes Science Center to conduct monitoring, respond to invasive species, study food webs and deep water ecosystems, and deploy an advanced technologies program to cover research and observation of the lakes, which are covered in ice and inaccessible for 5 months of the year. Great Lakes, of course, have some of the most productive and economically important fisheries in the country. It generates $7 billion annually in economic impact and support more than 1.5 million jobs. And despite the great economic importance of Great Lakes fisheries, The management of these resources is not supported by stable funding sources, and instead it's supported by a mix of discretionary spending line items within the Department of Interior. This lack of dedicated funding has enabled money for USGS survey programs to be redirected for other uses. We saw one example of this in 2018 when $1 million was redirected from the USGS fisheries program to support research on unconventional oil and gas drilling, of all things. That's why Mr. Quigley's bill is so important. This bill is good governance, it's broadly supported, has 18 co-sponsors, 10 of which are Republicans, all from the Great Lakes region. It's clear that this bill is vital to the future of Great Lakes fisheries, the tribal nations that depend on them, and the 1.8 million anglers who enjoy fishing the Great Lakes every year. So I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the legislation? HR 1023? If there's no, oh. Congresswoman, recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seek recognition and support of this legislation. I want to thank you for including the Great Lakes Fishery Research Reauthorization Act of 2019 in this markup. This bipartisan legislation will strengthen our understanding of Great Lake fisheries and provide additional resources for research into the Great Lake Basin's fishery and biology. The U.S. Geological Survey's Great Lakes Science Center carries out the equivalent work on the Great Lakes that NOAA carries out on the coast, and the Department of Interior is in the lead on the Great Lakes. The center's headquarters is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, my district, along with its biological stations and research vessels throughout the Great Lakes Basin, providing critical monitoring, scientific assessments, and research in support of the fisheries between the United States and Canada that lie within the Great Lakes Basin. USGS has never had formal authorization to do this important work. HR 1023 corrects this while bringing Great Lakes science into the 21st century. This bill also authorizes the use of advanced technologies for data gathering. The Great Lakes face a unique challenge. When gathering fishery data, they go dark because of ice cover and severe weather conditions. Cutting-edge technologies authorized by this legislation will not only address this need, but also enable scientists to deliver near real-time data on quickly emerging crises, such as potential fisheries crashes or new and unwelcome invasive species like the Asian carp. Additionally, this dedicated funding stream provided by this legislation will allow the USGC, the Great Lakes Science Center, to fulfill its commitments to the states and the tribes. This bill modernizes, streamlines, and updates these vital programs to bring Great Lakes science and technology into the 21st century. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation and yield back.
Thank you. Any further discussion? If there's no further debate on the legislation, we'll turn to amendments. Representative McClintock, you have the next amendment, designated number 1. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply removes the authorization for appropriations for the bill for a very simple reason. The very same work is already administered by the U.S. Geological Survey, for which the administration has already requested $44 million this year to support that program. And in addition, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration receives $28 million for ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes research, and another $2.9 million for interjurisdictional fisheries grants that includes the Great Lakes. Under the 1954 Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries, the U.S. Geological Survey is already required to conduct research for deepwater ecosystems. This bill requires them to conduct research for deepwater ecosystem sciences. The USGS is already required to conduct research into food webs. This bill requires them to research biological and food web components. USGS is required to conduct research on fish movement and behavior. This bill requires them to conduct research on fish movement and behavior investigations. I mean, if all of this sounds similar, it's because it is. We're already doing it. I appreciate the majority's enthusiasm for fishery monitoring in the Great Lakes Basin. We're already doing that. My advice to them is to give a speech on the House floor supporting the work of NOAA and the USGS in monitoring the Great Lakes fisheries, and to support the administration's request for $44 million to continue this work. We don't need to fund an entirely duplicative program for them to demonstrate their support for these endeavors. Yield back.
Yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Gentlelady?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect to my colleague who I have great respect for, it's not an increase of $17 million. It's an increase of $9 million. $1 million to restore the loss of basic fishery science capabilities and science workforce. $2.5 million to accelerate the development of new technology to control invasive species, and $5.5 million to modernize autonomous and remote sensing capabilities. While it is true that the USGS has conducted these functions without specific authorization, the fisheries programs budget has been a piggy bank for other administration priorities and needs its own reliable line of funding to support science and management. For example, in 2018, $1 million was redirected to the USGS's fisheries programs for USGS research on unconventional oil and gas, which resulted in a loss of $200,000 in funding for the Great Lakes fisheries science. Recognizing this budget shortfall, Great Lakes states, partners, and bipartisan congressional offices have requested at least $15 million budget for the USGS's Great Lakes Science Center since 2010. I'd like to remind my colleagues that this bill is completely bipartisan and actually has more Republican co-sponsors than it does Democrats, and all signed on with this authorization amount. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Else wish to be heard? Thank you. On the amendment? If there's no further discussion, hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. McClintock, designated as number 1. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I ask for a roll call.
Gentleman asked for a recorded vote. Vote is postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Now, this HR 2405, Sea Grant College Program Act. The item is for consideration is HR 2405, offered by Representative Huffman from California. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm ready this time, and I want to thank you for including my bill, this bipartisan bill, in the markup. H.R. 2405 reauthorizes and amends the National Sea Grant College Program. This is a program that benefits every coastal and Great Lakes community in the United States. More than 40% of the United States population lives in coastal shoreline counties. These communities depend on the ocean for fisheries, tourism, coastal ecosystem services, and shipping, among other things. Businesses and jobs directly dependent on ocean and Great Lakes resources contribute $352 billion to the U.S. gross domestic product annually and employ over 3.1 million Americans. And so maintaining healthy oceans and Great Lakes is critical to sustaining livelihoods, cultures, and economies around the country, and every single person in the United States depends on the ocean for the food they eat, the air they breathe, and for regulating the climate that we live in. So it should go without saying, we have to keep our oceans healthy to ensure our economies, communities, and planet continue to thrive. And this is where the Sea Grant program comes in. Sea Grant is a federal-state partnership that directs federal resources toward applied research, outreach, education, and science communication To address pressing issues related to the environmental and economic sustainability of coastal, ocean, and Great Lakes resources, Sea Grant has consistently had wide bipartisan support because of its effectiveness and its importance to communities all over the country. I would like to thank my colleagues from both sides of this committee, including Congresswoman Radewagen, Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, and Congressman Whitman for co-sponsoring this bill. Now, despite the support from many Republican colleagues, the ranking member has insisted that this bipartisan bill be considered under regular order rather than unanimous consent, which is disappointing. I would remind everyone that during the legislative hearing on this bill, supportive comments for the Sea Grant program were offered on both sides of the aisle. Sea Grant has an incredible successful record of leveraging federal resources with state and local funds. In 2017, the program reported $579 million in economic impact, a 699% return on a federal investment of $72.5 million. With these leveraged funds, Sea Grant has protected or restored over 700,000 acres of habitat, improved resilience for 462 communities, and created or sustained 2,500 businesses and 12,500 jobs. The fund also supports critical research on aquatic non-native species, oyster restoration and disease, harmful algal blooms, and fisheries. Continuing support for Sea Grant is even more important right now, considering the myriad threats facing our ocean, coasts, and Great Lakes resources, including climate change, pollution, invasive species, harmful algal blooms, and overfishing. Yet despite the critical role that this program plays in researching and addressing these impacts, the Trump administration's fiscal year 2020 budget proposed to completely eliminate funding for Sea Grant. Reauthorizing this program through this legislation would provide the program with certainty by authorizing appropriations for the program through 2025. The appropriations outlined in this bill start at the same amount as the Senate Republican-led bill, which has bipartisan support and went through markup by unanimous consent. Sea Grant funding has remained fairly flat over the past 10 years, and the modest increase in funding in this bill accounts for inflation and ensures that the program can continue to meet the growing needs of coastal communities and economies. So this reauthorization would also make changes to the program that would increase equity in fellow placement, which I know is an important subject to many on this committee. It would allow for direct hire of former fellows and reduce cumbersome reporting requirements. I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand with our coastal communities and support the National Sea Grant Program. Reauthorizing this program will ensure that it continues to meet the growing needs of coastal communities and economies. And with that, I yield back.
Further discussion of the legislation? Hearing none, we'll begin the amendment process. I recognize myself an amendment designated Grijalva number 1. This amendment simply makes a technical correction to the bill to clarify the intention and the purpose of the authorizations. Both research and extension activities are part of the core elements of the National Sea Grant Program and should be authorized accordingly. And that is, is there any further discussion on the amendment before we vote, a technical correction? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment designated Grijalva number 1. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. Those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the bill is orderly. Oh, gentleman is asked a recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to prior instructions. The item under consideration is H.R. 473, offered by Representative Neguse from Colorado. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. And without objection, this bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this point, I would recognize the sponsor of the legislation for his comments, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including H.R. 473 to build a statue memorializing the women's suffrage movement in our markup today. Also, a thank you to Jane DeDecker, Jody Shattuck McNally, and all the members of the Every Word We Utter board for their tireless work on this legislation. At the forefront of the suffrage movement was a diverse and multi-generational movement of women, from their first official call for equality at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to demonstrations in the streets of the very city in which we sit now. Across multiple generations, from farms and villages throughout our country, women organized, educated, picketed, and demanded their enfranchisement. And through this brave and enduring movement, women received the vote. As a proud father of a one-year-old daughter, I want to ensure that my daughter and every girl growing up alongside her feels represented, empowered, and assured of the fundamental role they play in our society. And establishing this statute is a critical way to guarantee just that and to inspire the next generation to continue advocating for justice and equality for one another and for all that will follow them. H.R. 473 has bipartisan support, has 25 co-sponsors in the House. Its Senate companion is also bipartisan, being led in the Senate by Senator Cory Gardner and Senator Michael Bennet. I am very grateful to the support of many members of this committee, including my colleague, Mr. Lamborn, as well as Ms. DeGette. The bill authorizes the placement of a statue honoring the women's suffrage movement and will not cost anything to the federal government. The Every Word We Utter Monument Board and its supporters hope to have the statue authorized by August 18th, 2020, which is the centennial anniversary of women's suffrage. And of course, the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission continues to consider the bill and will be doing that next week. So I would respectfully request my colleagues support this incredibly important and, again, bipartisan bill. And with that, I would yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to speak to the legislation? Mr. Curtis. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my support to my colleague from Colorado with this bill and take advantage of this opportunity to tout Utah just a little bit. We will actually be replacing one of our two statutes next year, 2020, with Martha Hughes Cannon. Martha Hughes Cannon was the first woman state senator elected in the United States from Utah, even before women had the right to vote. Of interesting note to many Utahns is that she was my wife's great-grandmother, and she won that office by defeating her husband. And I just once again want to offer my support. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Young? No? Hearing none. If there's no further debate on the legislation, I have an amendment designated as number 1. We'll begin the amendment process. This amendment simply makes technical corrections. And is there further discussion on the amendment which makes technical corrections? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment designated Grijalva number 1. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended and ordered it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Speaker, or Chairman.
Sir.
You. Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intentions to file additional or dissenting views on the bills just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered in the committee today.
Without objection, sir. The item for consideration is H.R. 560, offered by Representative Sablan. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize Mr. Sablan to speak to his legislation. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee. I have been working for the last 11 years to make the transition to federal immigration policy in the Marianas as least difficult as possible. Last year, with Mr. Bishop's essential help, we protected the rights of U.S. workers against the need for foreign workers in the Marianas economy with Public Law 115-218. In July this year, the Trump administration helped us convert between 800 to 1,000 people living under administrative parole into Marianas residents with a permanent legal status in the Marianas only. That's Public Law 116-224. Today, H.R. 560 continues this work of smoothing over the rough places in the application of national immigration law to my isolated district. It provides the same permanent status in the Marianas only, again in the Marianas only, that President Trump approved for parolees in June. This time we want to give stability to a small group of investors who were there even before federal immigration. They have been holding on with short-term visas ever since, never certain from year to year about their business investments. Investments of $50,000 initially has grown for many to be large holdings. And we want to give the same certainty to a group of long-term workers and to the businesses that employ them. We held a hearing on H.R. 560 in February. Our Republican governor, the Honorable Ralph Torres, testified in favor in support of 560. The Trump administration did not take a position, but their witness noted, and I quote, "Without a sustained labor force, projected investment in the CNMI likely will wither," end quote. Well, we can do something to avoid that consequence by passing H.R. 560. Again, this bill is Marianas only. Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop are both co-sponsors, for which I am very grateful. And I ask all committee members now to vote in favor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
All right, you talked me into it.
Is anyone, any other member wish to talk about the legislation? To speak to the legislation? Without objection, the ANS offered by Representative Sablan is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Any amendments to this legislation? The question is now on Sablan's ANS to HR 560. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. If there is, what now? The question is on adopting HR 560 as amended, and order in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed indicate by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported as amended. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
With the cooperation, that's right, get rid of Grijalva. Thank you. With the cooperation of Ranking Member Bishop,
Would you say that again?
with the cooperation, this is such a historic occasion, of Ranking Member Bishop,
And only because you're here.
and the other members of the committee, it appears that we've worked out an agreement on 8 bills that are scheduled for markup today. Before we begin, does any member seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent request? Does any member wish to speak on any of the bills that are in the unanimous consent? All right. As we've done before, I'm going to make a single unanimous consent motion to discharge the agreed-upon bills. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 182, H.R. 2490, H.R. 2819. Any objection? Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 263, H.R. 1218, H.R. 1314, H.R. 1446, and H.R. 2189. Any objection? Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that my amendment in the nature of a substitute, and that's Mr. Grijalva, that Mr. Grijalva's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1218 be redesignated as introduced by Representative Cunningham and Representative Graves. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that the following bills be adopted and favorably reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 182, H.R. 263, H.R. 1218 with the amendment in the nature of a substitute filed by Representative Cunningham and Representative Graves, H.R. 1314 with a technical amendment number 1 filed by Chair Grijalva, H.R. 1446 with a technical amendment number 1 filed by Chair Grijalva, H.R. 2189 with a technical amendment number 1 filed by Chair Grijalva, H.R. 2490 with a technical amendment number 1 filed by Chairman Grijalva, and H.R. 2819 with a technical amendment number 1 filed by Representative and Chair Grijalva. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motions to reconsider are laid upon the table. Right now, go to this. The committee is in recess now, subject to the call of the chair, and we will reconvene at 12 noon. In recess.
Call the meeting back to order.
Sounds great, Grace.
So what am I doing first, the amendment? There's no amendments to this. There's no amendments here. The question is on final passage. The question is on adopting HR 737 and ordering favorably reported to the House. All those. A recorded vote having been requested, the members will record their votes using the keypad devices at their seats. Voting is now open.
Which one? Which amendment?
Oh, there's no amendments to shut. We don't have any amendments on that.
This is final passage.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no amendments to that. The recorded vote, final passage is on HR 737. Voting is open. It's not here. Has every member voted? Is there anyone who wishes to change their vote? If every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it, and the bill passes. The question, I read this first. Members, I'm asked unanimous consent to withdraw my motion to report HR 2406. The question, previous step that I omitted was the question on and my ANS is amended to HR 24 NS to HR 2406. All those in favor of the amendment? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, couple of things. First of all, you may want to actually tell your speech again so that people who haven't heard it have a chance to actually hear it. But the second process is it's important to have procedure. We don't have a great procedure here. We skipped a procedure, but this procedure is a redundant one. Everyone knew what they were talking about and what you were intending to do. So I certainly would not complain against this unanimous consent. I agree with what we're doing. Let's go forward with it.
Thank you. The question is unanimous. There's no objection to unanimous consent, it's accepted.
So that was to taking back the final passage, but we still need to do
The question remains on the ANS to HR 2406. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. The question is on adopting HR 2406 as amended and ordered in favor reported to the House. All those, the voting is now open. No, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported as amended. The motion
Roll call.
recorded vote having been requested, the members will record their votes using the keypad. Voting is now open.
We did that. Didn't we request a roll call? I thought we only requested a vote on that.
We did, he vacated it.
I see.
Because he had to go
The
back.
ANS.
Yeah.
Okay. Whitman?
Has
Rob?
everybody recorded their vote?
Rob?
Everybody confirmed their vote?
Oh, no.
Who's look, somebody lacking?
We're done now. We're ready now.
Okay, if I remember, has every member voted? If every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 14.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Returning to H.R. 2245, the question is on the unfinished business, the amendments to the ANS. The first one is the amendment designated McClickton number 1, for which there is a recorded vote. Voting is now open. The vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 18.
The nays have it, and the amendment passes. No? Oh, the fails, sorry. The amendment designated Lamborn number 2, voting is now open. They're being tight, aren't they? Has every member confirmed their vote? Anyone wishes to change their vote? If not, voting is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 19.
The amendment fails. Now, amendment number 3, Mr. Lambert, designated Lamborn number 3, voting is now open. I keep doing it. Everybody confirm their vote? Anyone wishes to change? If not, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 19.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The question is now on the NS as to H.R. 2245. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to And recorded vote has been requested. CECIL.
This is the ANS.
Yeah. The ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. The question is now final passage and adopting H.R. 2245 as amended and ordering in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is favorably reported. Recorded vote having been requested, voting is now open. Did I get it? No, I mean, I'm having trouble with mine. Has everyone voted? Everybody confirmed their vote? Voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the nays are 16.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported to as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We now go to amendments to H.R. 1380, the Big Cats legislation. The question is on this unfinished business. First is the amendment designated Bishop number 2. Voting is now open.
Bishop number 1 or number 2?
How many more do we have? Just that one? This is it for, yeah. Has everyone recorded their vote? Confirmed their vote? If the voting is now closed, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 19.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The question is on adopting H.R. 1380, an order in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. Recorded vote have been requested. Voting is now open. Has everyone confirmed their vote? The voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 14.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported to as of February. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Right? Okay, what's the next one? Returning to H.R. 1023, the question is on the unfinished business amendments. The amendment designated McClintock number 1. The voting is now open. That's all we have there, right? Just one? Has everyone confirmed their votes? If so, voting is closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 20.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The question is now on adopting H.R. 1023 in order in favor report it to the House. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Record has been requested. Voting is now open. Give me the script for the end. Something I have to say. Has everyone voted? Confirmed their vote? Voting is closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 20 and the nays are 15.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered, favorably reported. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. C-Grant final passage. The question is on adopting H.R. 2405 as amended and ordered and favorably reported to the House. A recorded vote having been requested. Voting is now open. That's it, right? Still, that was giving me trouble. Everybody confirm their vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 23 and the nays are 12.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered, favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. That's the end of the business section. I want to, all members will have 2 days in which to file supplemental, additional, minority, or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill or bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I also ask unanimous consent that any bill ordered reported today with amendments, that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted by committee. Without objection, so ordered. What?
By voice.
Again, I thank the ranking member Bishop and the other members of the committee for helping to move this markup along with unanimous consent agreement. There, no further business, meeting adjourned.